All right. If you'll recall last time, we were talking about Native American identities. This time and next time, the article that Jake will be talking about, we're more focusing. Certainly identity is part of the picture here, but the focus is more on the pragmatic deployment of culture in social movements. I realize we could go another. I could have taken this in another place, in terms of really talking more about framing in social movements. And again, I would, encourage you, if that, is your interest, to kind of read up a bit on that, or just take my social movements class, because the way that movements manipulate culture really does matter for relations to the wider society. How you frame your messages, how you sell your ideas. It's not enough. As we'll kind of see in the Eyerman article or in the Rosinha article, it is important to sort of rally the masses, or not the masses, rally your constituents, the people who are closest to you, who are already on board. Of course, that's important, and it's important to let them know of things that are happening in the movement, whether that's a strike or a demonstration or a boycott or something like that. But of course, it's also important to manipulate the mass media to one extent or another. Right? You really want sympathy from people who aren't necessarily in your movement. If you are a striking worker, you don't want people, for example, and we've seen some of this in the last couple of years with teacher strikes, right? You don't just want people to say, oh, these, entitled teachers, they only work 6 months a year anyway, and why are they striking? In a big part, of course, of the reason that teachers were striking was because they want more money. They think they're underpaid. They want better health insurance, those kinds of things. But you'll see that the way that the message was crafted in those strikes were largely around we want smaller class sizes, we want better resources for teaching your kids. And obviously that appeals to parents. They're like, oh yeah, these teachers can't do their job, then no, that's important because that appeals to me and my kids. But also framing that message somehow around, teachers do this heroic job, and to people who don't have kids, saying like, oh, it's really, it's important to have a well-educated next generation because you'll need doctors and nurses to take care of you in your old age or whatever it is. So again, different movements have to do that job. We call that framing, to sell their message, to sell whatever it is that they are looking for. But today, with Eyerman, it's more of, at least in my reading, it is looking at the motivation of people who are more or less already in movements or who are really close to being into movements. So, and again, maybe. Maybe I didn't think of this. Maybe we're focusing too much on Nazis, because we do get more Nazis today. But also, obviously, civil rights demonstrators, civil rights activists in the 60s. And he's not doing a lot of the work as you would see, in a traditional movements paper on, on the real like pragmatic dimensions of recruiting people, or getting money and those kinds of things. That's, this other literature on resource mobilization that we're not going to really go into. And he's a little bit critical of that work as well, which I'm not sure that he's really necessarily justified in being, but he's writing for a qualitative sociology journal, so I guess it makes a little sense that he would do that. The literature on resources, you have to understand. I think if you're going to understand movements, you have to understand resources, but you do have to as well understand the role of culture. And he's right, certainly to some extent, that the movements literature, certainly through the 80s or so, didn't pay enough attention to that. But really, in the last 30 years or so, really, we have paid much more attention to the role of culture. And so he's essentially saying here that movements are motivated by deep symbols, or maybe a better way of phrasing that is to say that individuals in a movement are motivated by important symbols. So, and there is here, the contrast for him would be with somebody who says that, people take part in movements because they are purely rational actors. That position would be to say that you don't take a place in a movement, you don't take part in a movement unless you think you're going to get something out of it personally. We could get deep in with this stuff, but it's things like this guy Olson, who wrote about this stuff in the 60s, said nobody would join the farm union. So there was organizations like the Grange that work for farmers, on their issues, to lobby the government for better insurance or for relief if there's a flood, or to buy their crops. As I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, but the government has been, since we've been in this trade war with the Chinese aren't buying American soybeans. So the American government has paid something like $18 billion to farmers to make up for those losses. And that's kind of the outcome of a very successful social movement on the part of farmers. The question, though, in social movements is, why would a farmer want to participate? Why would a farmer want to join in and pay dues or go to meetings and write letters to the government if they know that other people are going to do it for them? The rational actor, the argument goes that the rational actor sees that the individual, his own individual contribution is very small and is more or less a waste of resources, especially if somebody else is going to do something. And so the traditional literature on why people participate, like I said, this guy Moncur Olson, focuses on how generally, traditionally, movements give you something else. So with the farm movement, that something else was farmer's insurance, right? So you could get farm insurance through the Grange. The Grange, organized this so that you would pay just like any insurance, you would pay so much money per month. And if there was a flood and you lost your crops that year, then you'd get money from the Grange to make up for your losses. But the Grange arranged it in such a way that they were making some money on top of that to finance the organization in order to do that lobbying to get the government to make the kind of changes. So what did he call this? A selective incentive, right? So this is the traditional argument. Let's try to figure out where the screen is here today. All right. So the traditional argument in the social movements literature is that a movement has to provide, adjust my tie, okay, a movement has to provide selective incentives. And so that would be things like I say, insurance, it's funny, insurance is actually remains kind of a big one for certain kinds of organizations, right? So we can also look at professional organizations like the American Medical Association for doctors or the American Sociological Association for sociologists. These are social movement organizations, right? These are organizations that try to solve problems for a particular group of people or try to advocate for issues for particular people. They have lobbyists in Washington. They organize, letter writing campaigns and that sort of thing. But nobody would buy into the American Sociological Association if they didn't get something out of it. And we do actually get some kind of insurance through ASA. I haven't left. I think it's like life insurance or travel insurance. You get a little something. It's like an extra incentive, like join up. But for groups like these professional organizations, though, obviously there are journals and meetings. And we call it a selective incentive because these are things that only people who pay in can get them. They are part of the broader mission, but they're not the whole mission. And there is this whole mission out there for these kind of movements to do other things, to generally advocate for certain groups of people. But again, this idea, the free rider idea is, if ASA was representing sociologists in Washington and, working to get more grants for sociologists, if they didn't give me some reason to pay them, I wouldn't pay them. I'm not just going to abstractly pay for them to do lobbying because I know somebody else is going to pay in, or I hope somebody else will pay in, but I have no particular incentive to pay in. So we need these selective incentives. That's, again, the traditional argument. What Eyerman is working to provide, though, and again, he positions himself a little bit, I think, like he's almost alone in the world doing this, but there is, a growing literature on this idea, that was already growing when this is a 2002 article. It was already pretty well out there at the time. That there are things about which we've been talking about a little bit, collective identity, right? So I'll say more recent argument here, but again, this is really, from the 80s onward, and really, through the 90s. I think this represents the if not the bulk, then maybe a plurality of researchers in movements, is really looking at culture. So again, collective identities, and specifically the argument that Eyerman is presenting is what he says. He says deeply motivating symbols, or motivated movements are motivated by deep symbols and memories and he also brings up networks. A little bit like we were talking about last time, right? We could think of a network, although he says, specifically network as taste culture. So people who have similar taste in things like, well, specifically here, music. Cultural stuff, though, right? Overall, people's motivation for joining a movement doesn't have to be these. Well, and here's where I should give you the caveat that rational choice people are still out there. There are people who still argue in that traditional sense, who would say that this stuff is just a different kind of selective incentive. More, cultural sociologists don't like to see things that way. They argue that it's qualitatively different, and I think too, if you look at some of that, and now I'm forgetting which article exactly we were talking about, when we talked about Simi. We talked about the haters last time, or a couple classes ago. That this motivation is really not rational. So if you'll remember with the Simi article about the recovering white supremacists, that white supremacy, those cultural ideas, those behavior patterns, the argument goes, are deep rooted within people's their psyche, their cognition, but even arguably inside their bodies. And so this is really saying that people aren't making rational decisions to be participants in these movements, or to take part in in whether it's civil rights activity or white supremacist activity. It's not necessarily I'm going to do this for the good of me or mankind or anything like that. It's just like it's this pattern that you get yourself into that you may not even really. It's difficult too with some of this literature nowadays. Is the argument even goes to, if you asked somebody to tell you why did you go to that march on Selma, Alabama, or something like that, right? Why did you take part in this movement activity? They'll come up with reasons that sound incredibly rational. And to some, it's not to say these aren't true reasons, but they'll say something like, well, I want my kids to live in a world free of hate, or where everybody's equal, or I personally want more equality. I want to be able to vote, blah blah blah. And it's not to say that that's not true, but this literature that Simi was referencing is really saying that those reasons, those sort of post hoc explanations of why people take part in activities, often may not really be the reason why people take part in activities, or certainly why they do things in the certain ways that they do. In fact, the argument goes that these kinds of activities, or many kinds of activities, and some argue more forcefully than others. I think Kahneman and others certainly say, the bulk of human action is that what we call the type 1 action, things that you do just fast and automatically. So if your friends say, we're going to go and march on Washington, you're like, oh yeah, okay, we're going to march on Washington. Not that you're a dupe or a dope, but that you just kind of you follow these patterns. You don't really think too hard about what behaviors you'll engage in. And I think that's Eyerman's writing a little bit before that literature was really kind of coalescing with the behavioral economics and the cognitive psych that we use nowadays. But and I should say, if you're interested in that stuff, I haven't read it yet, but the latest issue of the American Journal of Cultural Sociology is all about that culture and cognition business. So again, Eyerman's writing before that literature had really coalesced, but I think he's drawing pretty similar conclusions. And again, the idea is that people are motivated at a fairly deep level by these, again, symbols. And he, he's talking, about, symbols including, and you'll remember this from Simi as well, like the swastika, really can motivate racists to engage in activities, can make them feel certain things, feel, whatever, white pride or just the feeling of pride in general, that motivates them to engage in activities. And so let's look at a couple of other things here he's drawing on to build up the argument. Raymond Williams's culture concept. And again, if you have any questions, jump in at any time. Williams's culture tripartite concept, and I'm not sure. For my money, Williams gets a lot of citations and whatnot. He's a Marxist sociologist from England. Was a Marxist sociologist from England. He's either quite old now or perhaps dead. But anyway, Raymond Williams, three-part concept of culture, which we've actually addressed a little bit at some point. The hegemonic culture, I think. But he talks about residual culture, which is important. This is so residual. He talks about what subcultures and traditions. The argument. This is kind of very 60s, 70s Marxism kind of stuff, is that there's like this undercurrent of old culture that kind of persists despite or through or underlying, not really underlying in a sense of undergirding, but like the secret history or the secret culture it's not really secret, but that is not explicitly endorsed by capitalists or by people in power. And some of this stuff, you'll experience, we do experience, on the daily. To some extent, I think language holds out here, or is part of this, right? There's no power structure trying to enforce, at least for Americans, not really a power structure trying to enforce a kind of English speaking, or there are certain power structures that do, but if you've ever heard somebody with a Brooklyn accent, you know that, or a Boston accent, God forbid, that they are, speaking a form of language that is not, endorsed by any school or television media capitalist formation, anything like that. So you would include I think culture like that, but also very much things along the lines of how we celebrate holidays. I don't know if you probably don't do this with your parents anymore, but maybe you will. You're at home. A couple of you are living at home now. Are you going to dye Easter eggs on? No. Nobody's dyeing Easter eggs. Okay. Well, I'm going to dye Easter eggs. My kids are still young enough, obviously. That's freaking weird. All right, it's weird to dye. We're gonna dye eggs and then hide them around the house and let the children find them, right? I assume at some point in your lives you all participated in this tradition.
We did the ones where we didn't dye the eggs themselves. We had the plastic ones full of candy.
We had with money in them.
And money, nice. So that's a much saner way to do it, probably, because with the hard-boiled eggs, there's always the chance that you miss one, and then there's a smell in the house like a month later, and you're like, ooh, what's that all about? So okay, but even if you think about the plastic egg full of candy or money, that's pretty weird, right? This is some weird stuff that we do. These traditions that and again, maybe capitalism encourages them to some extent, but honestly, this kind of organically comes from weird pagan traditions from 1,000 years ago. I mean, why is there such a creature as the Easter Bunny? I mean, what? Easter Bunny? Tooth fairies? Santa Claus? All that sort of stuff. So. Again, Williams calls it residual culture. It's a residue left by, I call it organic behavior, behavior by real people that's not really associated with any capitalistic structures. He then also talks about emergent culture, which is culture created by movements. And again, this is fairly well in the Marxist tradition of things. So this is saying, that there are social movements, actors who are really trying to subvert whatever system there is out there. And often what this means is saying the world need not be as it is. So clearly, we'll get a bit into it in a moment, but really his example is things like "we shall overcome." And again, there's there are rabbit holes. Speaking of rabbits, there are rabbit holes to go down here. In terms of how Marxists think about the possibilities of creating new culture, because there are certain Marxists who believe that this stuff even is not very meaningful. Clearly, Eyerman thinks that this kind of behavior is pretty meaningful and is fairly effective, and think as well, in terms of the idea that these kinds of cultural activities, really do seek to actively subvert or overturn a system of relations. With the civil rights movement, probably clearer than any other movement, that the effort there is to undo a particular, what Marx would call a mode of production that really kept African Americans in the lowest wage jobs or even unemployed in order to maintain a system of low wages that benefited white capitalists above all. So again, that's emergent culture that's seeking to overthrow or undo certain arrangements. And that's really in the service of trying to combat the dominant culture. You'll also see, and again, not to get too far down the rabbit hole of Marxist cultural analysis. And again, I think Griswold makes some reference to this at some point. The idea of hegemony, the dominant culture. And for Williams, this would be specifically created by capitalists in service of furthering their interests, or at least maintaining a particular system of power relations and dominance. This can be, often is, hegemonic. You don't even think about undoing the kinds of culture or cultural, God bless you, or cultural relations that dominate in society. So it's like, trying to think, it's so much, because we're in an interesting moment, right? Some of this stuff really is the hegemony is cracking. I'm trying to think of the idea of you go shopping X times a week or something like that, or the idea that one would go to a McDonald's and sit down and have a meal. I mean, that's an automatic way of living for so many Americans. And we called it, we say that's hegemony. You don't think about it. You're like, okay, we just had, and man, if you look at McDonald's advertising, or any of these big corporate restaurant advertisings, what's the one, eating good in the neighborhood? Is that Applebee's, Chili's? I don't know. Or welcome to Chili's, right? All that sort of stuff. It's like, this is just a natural way of eating, of being. This is the right way to do things. It takes something to subvert that. So clearly, there are some social movements now that are like, don't eat at McDonald's, that's crazy. Beef is evil, it's killing the planet, blah, blah, blah. Or it takes something like a pandemic to say, no, you're not just gonna stop at McDonald's, or you might think twice about just this going to kill me? Welcome to children's. Okay, so again, the focus for Eyerman here is on this emergent culture. And the focus is both on, I think, the fact that this emergent culture is subverting the hegemony, is working against the dominant culture, but I think more pointedly even that it is motivating, that culture can be really a tool, and music specifically as a tool to get people to do things, again, yeah, motivating. So what is that? What is that? So specifically with We Shall Overcome, you know, I actually kind of gave you a preview of this argument a while back. I'd forgotten that this article addresses this tune, but I think if you recall anything from the before times, you know, I showed those videos of like Pete Seeger like singing "We Shall Overcome" with a bunch of white German people. So that's really the case that he's focusing on, and he's looking at it, you know, as emergent and as you know, very calculated, right? So in addressing this idea that memory is invented, you know, or there's also I think it's Benedict Anderson wrote about, you know, the invention of tradition. Like there is nothing that is traditional. There is nothing that is, well, you know, having said this, you know, there is nothing that's traditional. There is nothing that is necessarily remembered unless people do things in order for us to remember that stuff. I'm not sure that that's a really clear way of putting it. So in order to remember, people have to remember. That's not a good way to put it either. In order to remember things, people have to go out of their way to sort of put a you know, tie a bow around a memory, or tell a story, produce a narrative, or produce a cultural object like a song that people can hold on to, right? So it's, you know, with the Easter tradition, it's like, you know, the fact of the eggs, like that's something to hold on to. That people, you know, went out of their way to produce these eggs, and, you know, your parents went out of their way to, you know, either dye the eggs or stuff the eggs and send you on egg hunts and this kind of a thing to create memories for you. And they're selecting certain things, you know, to make memories or to not make memories about. So again, we shall overcome. And I don't think, well, there's a couple of ways to go with this. I mean, so first of all, when Seeger does this, you know, really appropriates this song, in a sense, he is creating a memory of a song that only kind of existed in this way, because you'll remember, you know, there are earlier versions of this song that are a spiritual that's crafted as like, I will overcome. He's taking it, creating a different memory, making the song into We Shall Overcome. Now nobody remembers the I will overcome, or maybe some people do, but not very many. Remember the I will overcome. But more pointedly to people who study sort of music and cognition, the other thing here is that the emplotment of music is tied to events. Or sort of another way to put it, music unfolds in time alongside events. The argument here is that because music is a temporal thing, you can take other cultural objects, again, a symbol like the swastika, right, is static. And that's not to say, clearly it can conjure up feelings, emotions, etc. For people, maybe it conjures up memories, but again, it is static. It doesn't necessarily tie as well to events as music, which is by nature diachronous. It occurs over time. So when you are singing, or when you're in an event and listening, or when you are dancing to this music, it is going along in time with whatever event you are participating in. And so the argument is that having something like "We Shall Overcome" being sung at like the March on Washington or something like that makes it a much more apt cultural object to conjure memories, because you'll actually be able to remember, and at this point in your life you probably have some of this already, like whatever I don't know, do you remember the song that was played at prom or something? Nothing like that, no. Okay.
I think it would be cool to put like a list together of all the, or a lot of songs that were in social movements, and see like what key they were in. Cause like thinking of specifically like G minor or F sharp minor, they're like really angry and gloomy songs. I wonder if those kinds of majors or minors are more used in different types of social movements.
Yeah, I wonder, and there's that, but there's also, what are the easiest songs to play on the guitar too, right?
Oh yeah, that's true.
But yeah, I'm having power issues here. Sorry. Yeah, and certainly you do see, specific qualities of the music that make for better music songs. So yeah, key would be one. The pacing of these songs, obviously, right? None of the protest songs are like really like upbeat, fast kind of things, because you have to be able to sing them when you're C, G, A, the four chords, yeah. The classics, yeah, and that's probably I guess it depends on the movement, right? Thinking about these Nazis, I've only listened to a little bit of this stuff because it's pretty terrible music on most levels. But yeah, I mean, they do go for the minor, like really crazy angry keys, right? They do, and I think you hit on a good thing too, that Eyerman really kind of misses, like the particular emotional content of these songs, that's like that we associate, loud guitars and minor keys with being really pissed off, right? That's different than whatever Pete Seeger was doing, right? Okay, so the creation of memory, right, and white power, blah, blah, blah. Should probably mention collective effervescences come up here again. If you'll go back in your notes, like to the really early talk of Durkheim on what the sacred and the profane, how things become sacred through collective effervescences. This is also the argument that Eyerman is making, that something like a civil rights march is a collective effervescence. You feel especially empowered or excited, and so the symbols that you see, and especially the songs that you sing that happen there, then take on this almost sacred feel, as he argues the white power songs do as well for Nazis. Also, yeah, this is really, to me, the most important stuff to take out of this reading. Again, it's just the idea essentially that that the kinds of music used in movements is this kind of emergent culture, is intelligently crafted. How to put it, is instrumentally, right? Is specifically used and deployed, and songs are chosen and written in order to be, the best songs for this movement, to make certain kinds of things happen. He also, he gives a shout out at the end to the political process and the political opportunity structure, saying things like the pop media culture in America made it a bit easier for Seeger to do his thing in the 50s and 60s, because you could see, as we saw in that like German TV show, you could take these tunes and go on television, and you might actually hear them on the radio. And obviously, you're familiar with any number of current or recent tunes that are sort of critical of, whether it's the power structure or the economy, probably in particular the power structure in this era. Again, the Donald Glovers, Childish Gambinos of the world who are making those critiques. Got a couple of minutes just to look. I'm going to look at your discussion questions here. Wait, that's next time. Eyerman. Okay, so Joel asks, right, does New Age media give subcultures representation they've never had before? Oh, so what do you mean by that, New Age media?
Well, in the article, they talked about like the subcultures of music and how they're not represented or whatever in that part. And I was just talking about that.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too. I'm getting all the classes are blending together. We talked about incels last time, right? Okay, good. I talked about them with the movements folks a bit too. They don't have music, right? But having social media, right, really enables people to get together and have that sort of stuff. And not Dan here. Eyerman here talks about, right, the using and it's so primitive at this point. 20 years ago, using the internet to sell CDs to people, right, enables that white supremacist culture. I mean, I imagine this is all, I don't know if you can listen to, wait a minute, I'm going to open up Spotify and see if I can listen to Derlewanger. And then I'll probably end up with some kind of watch list. So no, you can't listen to the band Derlewanger, but I can listen to a playlist by the Derlewanger Brigade, but there's nothing on it. Okay, so I guess Spotify doesn't enable this, but there probably are, right? There probably are new media sites that are promoting this kind of thing, or various kinds of things, right? And that is really a burgeoning area of research, right? Is how does new media, how does social media enable new kinds of movements? Sophia, is it more the lyrics or the melody? Good question. What do you think?
I mean, we kind of talked about that earlier when we were talking about like the chords. But I guess what I was thinking is like, do the people go for like the community? Like, I'm talking about these illegal concerts. Do they go for like the community and like the feeling of the music, or do they go because they actually listen to the lyrics and like identify with them?
Right. No, that's a good. Yeah, and I'm thinking too, like.
So as someone that like knows metal music and listens to metal music, like I don't know if you guys do or not, but a lot of the lyrics, like I'm thinking of this one band called Cannibal Corpse, and you cannot understand their lyrics whatsoever.
Right.
And you look at the lyrics and it's like I smashed like his head in and like all this stuff, and it's like just absolutely ridiculous. And like I don't think people go to the concerts to relate to the songs that talk about like ripping out intestines and stuff like that. I think I think they more go for like the act of stress relief.
Right.
Because like I know that even when I go to like a concert, like like the act of moshing is more of like a stress relief thing, and like it's just like part of the culture. So it's not necessarily the lyrics. In some cases, it's more of the experience thing.
Yeah, that sounds right. And interesting to it. Yeah, so so it's a variable, right? Because I think "We Shall Overcome," like that's 90% about the lyrics, right? Nobody was moshing at the March on Washington. And I was going to ask, so people do still mosh though? That's still a thing.
Oh yeah, people still mosh a lot.
Okay. Yeah, right. So then, yeah, collective effervescence, right? The feeling, more about the feel of the music than any of the semantic content. Good. And let's see, one more. Look at Jacob. So, right. Why have subcultures limited access to the means? Do you mean? I'm sorry, what you wrote is, why have subcultures recently limited access to the means of representation? Do you mean like the subcultures themselves have taken steps to, and I misplaced my article, the subcultures themselves have worked to limit access, or the authorities have limited access?
I would say the subcultures themselves.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that is?
I'm not sure. I'm not quite too sure.
Yeah, I mean, it probably depends on the movement itself, right? Because if you're a white supremacist, I mean, and he gives kind of a good example in the article of when the white supremacists were publicly outed, it had pretty significant consequences for some. People lost their jobs and things, right? So you don't, you hide behind um, your internet personalities or whatever if you're a part of certain subcultures. But I think certainly there are still subcultures in social movements that crave publicity, right? So this is again a variable. If you're part of a largely unaccepted or unacceptable culture, then you're going to want to hide out. If you're what's something more innocuous? If you're part of the anti-gun movement, though, if you're, I can't remember his name now, the kid from Stoneman Douglas, right? Who's going on Twitter. There are people who really seek out publicity and really seek out spreading the message. So again, kind of think about it as a variable. Yeah, but it is interesting, and I think really there's a lot of research to be done on these more isolated, hidden, secretive social movements like the Nazis or the incels, right? And they're dangerous, as we've seen. Okay, so we don't have a class on Friday. So have a good Friday and a happy Easter if you're into those sorts of things. If you don't, then just have a nice break. Good luck on those exams, Jake, and I'll see you on Monday. Okay. So, bye-bye.